So if you remember in that very first chart that I showed you, can you just go back to that first slide? There we go. So interpretation of tongues is its own gift. There is tongues, you see it in the declarative gifts, there's tongues, but there's also interpretation of tongues. These are two different gifts at work. So here is the definition of interpretation of tongues. It's the ability to decipher the tongue that is said and to communicate it to those who are gathered. So the first time that I witnessed this happen, I was about 6 or 7 years old. I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and it was quite a big church, and it was my grandmother. My grandmother came up to the front, and she tapped the pastor on the shoulder. My dad was one of the pastors there, so we were always kind of like on the front row. So I saw her come up, and they walked up onto the stage, and the pastor at the time said, we have somebody with a word, gave her the mic, and she just in tongues. It was my first time to ever see or experience this. And you have to imagine, like as a 6 or 7 year old, I was like, what is happening? This is so weird. I was embarrassed for my grandmother. I was like, oh my gosh, this is a terrible thing. This is what I'm thinking. And then I remember it very well, because she was just a small little woman. This powerhouse thing came out of her. And the pastor then took the mic to invite, is there anybody in the room who might have an interpretation? I don't even think the words were out of his mouth, because by the time he's saying it, there's a man already on his way up, comes up, grabs the mic, and just speaks an interpretation. And the whole room, I don't remember exactly, I was so little, but I do remember how encouraging and edifying it was to our church. The room just erupted in praise and thanksgiving, and we went into this crazy, awesome time of worship and thanksgiving. It was so cool. And of course, obviously, I didn't think it was, weird or I wasn't embarrassed for my grandmother or anything after that. I was like, oh man, she's awesome. And brave, I thought. She's brave. So another time, I'll just give you a couple more examples. Whenever I was in youth group, I was a little older by this time. We had a smaller youth group, and we were in a room, and it was not maybe 20 of us or something, maybe not even that many, and we're just worshiping. And there was an adult in the room, one of the youth leaders, and he just towards the tail end of worship just started speaking out loud. Like didn't go up to the front or anything, just started speaking out loud in tongues. And I knew what he was saying. Like I knew it. I knew what he was saying. And I also knew what that meant because I'd been in church long enough to know, oh man, that means I'm going to have to say what he's saying. And I don't know, I got all like, oh, it's so insecure and everything. But then he finished, and somebody else in the room said, does somebody have an interpretation? And when I tell you that it was like I couldn't keep my mouth closed. It just out of me. And I didn't go in it, like I just stood right where I was. I kept my eyes closed and just said it, and then same thing. Both, and I'm not saying that this is a qualifier for it, but it is interesting to me that both of those moments happened out of a time of worship, at a time of just focusing our eyes on the Lord. Third example, and actually Chris and I were just talking about this, that in his old church, in pre-service church prayer, sometimes this would happen. There'd just be a small group of people, they'd be praying, somebody would get a word in tongues, and then somebody else in the circle would interpret it. Like just super, super low key. It's not like this crazy thing. So I want to point out one last thing about the public use of tongues. Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 14 how it needs to be ordered. I hit on that a moment ago. Because the church in Corinth, as Daryl sort of hit on earlier, it was disordered. It was disordered. And so Paul is big on this in verse 27 or 28. If you'll remember, he says, if anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or at the most 3 should speak, one at a time, and someone must interpret. So why does Paul tell us that it needs to be ordered? Besides the fact that just makes a lot of good sense. Why does Paul tell us that it needs to be ordered? Well, in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 23, it says this, so if the whole church comes together and everyone speaks in tongues, and inquirers or unbelievers come in, which, by the way, we hope they do, if inquirers or unbelievers come in, will they not say that you are out of your mind? This is what Paul is acknowledging. They will walk in and think you're crazy. So what Paul is saying is, listen, it needs to be ordered because God cares about unbelievers. He cares. And if we rewind even further to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and just read the whole chapter, we would see that the center of this whole thing is love. The motivation for this whole thing is love. God is concerned about people in our midst. And so if everybody in the room, you just have to imagine this, like if everybody in the room just starts speaking in tongues all at the same time loudly, it gets confusing to those who are among us, who maybe are unbelievers. And yes, it can appear that like chaotic. It can appear chaotic. So now, like, please hear what I'm saying. I'm not saying that in the church we always cater to unbelievers, or that we will never do things that make them, feel uncomfortable. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying though that we need to be concerned about them. We need to love them, and when there's no order and no structure, it can not only be confusing, but people can get hurt. And we're going to take this seriously at the church. We really want people. We want everyone to use the gifts of the Spirit. We want people to speak in tongues. We want there to be interpretation of tongues, but we want it to be done in a way that's true to Scripture. We want it to be done in a way that shows love and concern and care for others.